Alina loved walking through flea markets. She always found something interesting there: old books, unusual jewelry, or antique toys. One Saturday morning, she was walking between the aisles looking for something special when her eyes fell on a porcelain doll. The doll was sitting on a table between other old things, and its eyes seemed to follow the people who passed by. Her face was pale with thin red lips, and her hair was black, shiny like tar. She was wearing an old dress reminiscent of 19th century fashion, although the fabric was already worn and torn in places. Alina could not take her eyes off the doll. There was something about it that attracted her, a mixture of beauty and dark mystery. She walked closer, and the old saleswoman sitting behind the desk looked up and smiled. "Are you interested, girl?" she asked in a quiet, squeaky voice. Her eyes sparkled with a strange light. "This doll has a long history. She is looking for someone who can listen to her." Alina smiled, thinking that it was just the saleswoman trying to add mystery to the item to increase its price. But the doll was so strange that she wanted to take it. The old woman sold it for a penny, and when Alina left, the woman whispered after her, "Take care of her, child, and listen to what she says." Alina brought the doll home and put it on a shelf in her room. She named it Lily. The doll looked very beautiful. Her eyes, although glass, seemed to come to life in the light. They absorbed the light deeply, and sometimes Alina thought she saw her reflection in them, but slightly altered, as if her smile in the doll's eyes was slightly different. On the first night, when Alina was getting ready to go to bed, she thought she heard a light whisper. She looked around the room, but everything was in its place. The windows were closed, the wind could not get inside. She decided it was just her imagination. The next night, the whispering returned. It was barely audible, but distinct enough for Alina to hear her name. Alina, Alina. She opened her eyes and looked at the shelf where Lily was sitting. Her eyes seemed more sparkling than before, and her lips were slightly parted in a slight smile. "It's just a dream," Alina whispered to herself, trying to calm down. She closed her eyes and tried to ignore the feeling that the doll was looking at her. On the third night, things got even worse. Alina woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was looking at her. She opened her eyes and saw that Lily was no longer sitting on the shelf. The doll was standing on the floor, leaning on the bed, her eyes looking directly at Alina, and her lips were now even more stretched in a horrible, cold smile. Alina screamed, but her voice was not heard. She tried to shout out to her parents, but she couldn't. There was no sound in her throat. She felt fear gripping her heart and cold sweat running down her back. Her voice was gone. She couldn't even make a whisper. The doll stood silently by the bed, and now there was something sinister in its eyes. Alina realized that it was not just a doll. It was something more. Something that had come to her to take her voice, and perhaps something more. Alina woke up early in the morning in a cold sweat. She looked at Lily, who was now sitting back on her shelf as if nothing had happened. She felt panic in her chest. She knew that the previous night was real. She had indeed lost her voice. She tried to speak, to call her parents, but nothing happened. Instead of sounds, only a powerless whisper came out of her throat. Alina's parents were at a loss. They did not understand what was happening to their daughter. They took her to the doctor, but even after a thorough examination, the doctor did not find any physical problems. He only said that it was probably the result of stress or some kind of shock. Alina couldn't explain to them that it was the doll. She just couldn't say a word. She returned home, scared and disappointed. Her parents tried to reassure her, promising her that everything would be fine, that the doctors would find the cause. But Alina herself knew that the answer was hidden in her room, on the shelf where Lily sat, a doll with a porcelain face and empty but strangely alive eyes. That evening, when her parents had already gone to bed, Alina decided to act. She got out of bed and quietly walked over to the shelf. She took the doll in her hands and felt the coldness that seemed to radiate from her porcelain body. Her heart was beating fast and fear was gripping her every second, but she knew she had to do something. Alina decided to get rid of the doll. She took Lily to the kitchen, hid her in a bag, and went outside. She couldn't throw the doll in the trash near her house, so she decided to take it to a nearby park and leave it in the bushes. She knew that this might not get rid of the problem, but she tried to do at least something to escape from this horror. Leaving the doll in a remote corner of the park, Alina returned home feeling relieved. She thought that maybe now everything would be over, that the doll would stay where she left it. But the next morning, she was in for an even more terrifying surprise. When Alina woke up, the first thing she saw was the doll sitting on her bed. Lily was back, her glassy eyes fixed on Alina, and a slight smile on her lips, as if she knew that Alina would not be able to escape her. The girl felt a coldness envelop her body, as if all hope had just left her. Alina tried to scream again, but her voice was still missing. She no longer doubted that the doll had taken her voice, and now it seemed to want something else. Its gaze was directed at Alina, and it seemed to be a hidden demand. That night, when she went to bed, Alina felt completely helpless. She didn't know what to do anymore. The doll remained in her room, and its glass eyes never took their gaze off the girl. When Alina closed her eyes to try to sleep, she heard a voice. It was her own voice, sounding in the silence of the room. "You can't run away," the voice said. "I'm here, and now your voice is mine." Alina opened her eyes and saw the doll sitting on the shelf, her lips moving slightly as she spoke the words. Her heart sank, and she realized that this doll was not just a porcelain toy. It was alive, and it had evil intentions. Alina didn't know how much longer she could endure this horror. Every time she tried to get rid of Lily, the doll would come back. She lost her voice, and the feeling of helplessness gripped her more and more. Lily was always in the room now, sometimes on the shelf, sometimes on the floor, and sometimes Alina would wake up and find the doll by her bed. Her cold eyes would look at her as if waiting for something. One day, when her parents were away on business, Alina was left home alone. She decided that this time she would do everything to get rid of Lily forever. She knew that the only way left was to destroy the doll. She found a hammer in the closet in the pantry and held it in her hands as she looked at Lily. Her hands were shaking, but she knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to destroy the doll. Alina walked over to the doll, took it off the shelf, and put it on the floor. She picked up the hammer, but stopped for a moment. Lily was looking at her, and in her eyes, Alina saw something that made her freeze. It wasn't just the empty eyes of a doll, but something alive. Something that understood and even laughed at her fear. Suddenly, the doll began to move. Its head slowly turned, and its lips began to stretch in a smile that was not human. Alina was frightened and stepped back, but the doll had already stood up on its little porcelain legs. It stood in front of Alina, its eyes sparkling, and then the girl heard her own voice coming from Lily. "You belong to me," Lily said in her voice. "Your voice is mine now, and I will take everything else." Alina felt a chill go through her entire body. She realized that this was not just a doll. It was something more, perhaps some kind of curse or spirit that had found its embodiment in the doll. She knew she couldn't destroy Lily just like that. This doll had a power that was stronger than her. Unable to stand it, Alina grabbed the doll and ran out of the house. She ran to the garden behind the house, where her parents used to have bonfires, and began to try her best to light the fire. Her hands were shaking and her eyes were full of tears. She threw Lily into the fire, which had just begun to burn, and felt her heart beat furiously in her chest. The doll lay in the fire, and Alina stopped, looking at it. She expected Lily to just burn up, but instead she heard her own scream. The voice coming out of the doll was hers. Lily was screaming in Alina's voice, begging for help. But Alina couldn't afford to stop. She knew it was a trick, that this voice was just a way to get her to take the doll back. The flames grew stronger, and the screaming gradually subsided. The doll slowly burned down, and eventually only ashes remained. Alina felt the tension slowly ease, and her own voice seemed to return. She tried to speak, and at first only a wheeze came out. But then she was able to whisper, "I am free?" The next morning, when her parents returned home, they noticed that Alina was very tired, but happy. She spoke to them quietly, and although her voice was weak, she could speak again. She did not tell her parents anything about what had happened, but she knew that the doll would not return now. However, when she entered her room that evening, Alina felt a slight chill. She looked at the empty shelf where Lily used to sit, and felt that maybe it wasn't over yet. She knew that the doll was gone, but the evil that lived in her had left its mark. and this trace remained somewhere in the shadows, as an echo of what had happened, as a warning that even a destroyed doll can come back in another way. It had been several weeks since Alina had burned Lily's doll. Her voice was gradually returning, and although it was not as strong as before, she was very relieved to finally be free of that eerie presence. She tried to live her life as before, but sometimes she was still haunted by fear. At night, she had nightmares. She saw Lily standing in the corner of her room, smiling with that same cold, inhuman smile. One day, Alina decided to clean her room, to finally get rid of everything that might remind her of that doll. She took boxes of old toys, deciding to give them away or throw them away. Among all these things was one small box that used to be on the shelf next to Lily. Alina opened it and froze. Inside was a small ribbon that had once adorned Lily's dress. It was burnt around the edges, but not completely destroyed. Alina felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't remember leaving the ribbon behind. It was supposed to burn with the doll. She carefully took the ribbon in her hands, and at that moment, she heard something strange. The barely audible whisper that spread through the room was her own voice, coming from somewhere deep in her mind. "You didn't quit, Alina. I'm still here." Her heart beat faster, and her panic began to return. She threw the tape to the floor and stepped back, feeling her fingers tremble. The whispering didn't stop. It was getting louder, as if it was breaking through the thickness of her thoughts. That night, when she went to bed, her fear became stronger. The room seemed colder than usual, and the silence was oppressive. Alina lay in bed with the blanket over her and tried not to think about the tape, the doll, everything that had happened. She wanted to believe that everything was over, that the doll had burned and would not come back. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint rustle, as if something was sliding across the floor. She opened her eyes and saw a shadow creeping out of the corner of the room. It was no ordinary shadow. It was moving on its own, taking shape. It became more distinct until it turned into something familiar. Alina recognized the shadow. It was Lily. The shadow moved slowly across the floor, its shape indistinct, but resembling a doll. It was moving toward Alina's bed, and she felt terror grip her, clenching her throat again. She wanted to scream, but her voice seemed to disappear again. A whisper echoed in her head, the same eerie whisper that spoke, "You thought you could destroy me, but I'm part of you." Alina realized that the destruction of the doll could not completely break this connection. Part of the evil that lived in Lily remained with her. She felt a coldness envelop her entire body and a shadow approaching, almost touching her arm. Feeling desperate, Alina gathered all her strength and got out of bed. She grabbed the ribbon from the floor and ran to the kitchen. She needed to get rid of this remnant that connected her to Lily again. She opened the gas stove and threw the ribbon into the flames. The fire instantly engulfed her, and in the same instant, the whisper disappeared. The shadow that had been in the room vanished into thin air. Alina stood looking at the flames and felt the tension ease. Her voice, weak and hoarse, reappeared, and she whispered, "Go away, leave me forever." The fire burned out, and with it, Alina felt that some of her fear had also disappeared. She returned to her room, which now seemed calmer. She knew that perhaps the doll's shadow might still appear in her dreams, but it no longer had the power it had before. Alina felt that her voice had returned, and with it, her power. She went to bed with a blanket over her head and for the first time in a long time felt like she could sleep without fear. She knew she would never forget the nightmare, but now she was ready to put it behind her and move on with her life. The shadows no longer had any power over her, and she was ready to face the new day with the confidence that the evil that had once haunted her was now only in her past. Alina woke up the next morning feeling a strange sense of relief that she hadn't felt in a long time. Dawn was breaking through the curtains of her window, filling the room with a soft golden light. She sat up in bed and ran her hand down her neck, as if to check if her voice had really returned. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Good morning, world." Her voice sounded quiet, but it was her own. No strange whispers, no eerie echo. Alina smiled. She felt that for the first time in a long time she could just enjoy the new day. The parents noticed the changes in their daughter in the morning. She was smiling, talking, and even laughing. There were no more dark shadows under her eyes, which indicated sleepless nights. Alina became the cheerful girl she had been before all this horror. She no longer told her parents about the doll, didn't want to scare them, and tried to forget it herself, like a bad dream. Alina returned to school, and her classmates were happy to see her. Her friend Katya, who had been worried about her all this time, noticed that Alina was back to her old self, open and cheerful. She started participating in classes again, and her voice was no longer weak and hoarse. However, some traces of the past still remained. At night, when everything was plunged into darkness, Alina sometimes felt a slight chill, as if a shadow was passing through the room. But now she was not afraid of this feeling. She knew that even if the evil had left its mark, she now had the strength to cope with it. Her voice belonged to her and no one else. One day, passing by the place where a flea market used to take place, Alina stopped. The place was now empty, and the vendors with their wares were no longer visible. But she could smell the slight odor of old things, and memories of the day she first saw Lily came flooding back into her mind. She sighed as she stood there and spoke silently. "It's all in the past. Now I am free." Since then, she has never visited such markets or searched for old things with history. She realized that some stories are better left where they were. She realized that sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones we take into our homes without knowing what they hide. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Alina continued to live her life, and she greeted each new day with gratitude that she had been able to escape the horror that had haunted her. She realized that the evil that lived in Lila was perhaps part of something bigger, but she had no intention of plunging back into that dark world. Now she has put this experience behind her, and although the shadows of the past might sometimes flicker into her life, they no longer have power over her. Alina became stronger. She knew that the shadows could reappear, but this time she would no longer be a defenseless girl afraid of a porcelain doll. She had become someone who was in control of her life and would no longer let the darkness take away anything valuable. And with each new dawn, Alina greeted the light with a smile, leaving her fears in the dark where they belong.